course. Welcome to Thursday Garden Chat, the weekly public service broadcast from Garden Masterclass. Our normal business is putting on webinars and live events, mostly in the British Isles, and we've got a couple of left before we take a bit of a break for summer. Day at Tom Stuart Smith's amazing plant library at Surge Hill, coming in a couple of weeks, and another tour of Maurice Foster's Arboretum in Kent, with a real focus on summer flowering shrubs, which inevitably means hydrangeas. And of course, I'm addressing here an audience who knows very well that hydrangeas are not all like that. Many of them are far more interesting, delicate, beautiful plants. So that's a great opportunity to look around a really special private arboretum. So those events are on our diary pages on the website. At the moment, we are trying to put together courses and events, webinar events for the sort of autumn to spring garden education season, and we're very much casting around for ideas. Annie and I are very much in an ideas mode at the moment. If there's any particular subjects you want us to cover, people who you think are really good presenters, or anything else you think we should know about, then do please tell us. We're really grateful when people do send in ideas. If you're new to us, we have a monthly newsletter. In fact, the newsletter is going to be going out tomorrow, hopefully. You can sign up for that on the website. You can become a member, which entitles you to various discounts, and to podcasts, which are members only, and the members archive, which is something like 200 hours worth of material recorded on these Thursday sessions. And which I would remind you, these Thursday evening events and our YouTube channel are entirely done for no money whatsoever. So we do appreciate the occasional donation to sort of help with running costs, and an appreciation of the fact that everyone gives their time for free. So I think that's all the introductory stuff. Over to you, Annie.
Great, thank you. Well, it's a very momentous day here in the UK. I mean, I don't need to remind everybody that it's voting day, and I hope everybody's gone and done everybody in the UK, obviously, who's done their duty, and we're all waiting with bated breath for a fresh start, for some honest politicians, and maybe, a new dawn and a new day, to quote Nina Simone. But of course, it's a momentous day over the other side of the pond as well. It's 4th of July, where there'll be fireworks going off like mad, I imagine. And we have the lovely Molly Hendry back for another visit. Molly was with us a couple of years ago now, I think, Molly, wasn't it? I think, it was back in the back. Oh, Noel, you're muted, Noel.
Yeah, well, one of the very few people we've actually had back, which is not a reflection on people being had.
No, it's because she's so special.
There are so many really, really interesting and good people to talk to, so it's not a privilege to be asked back. Molly.
Yeah, and Molly's in Birmingham, Alabama, and she said she was going to be wearing her stars and stripes, but she's definitely wearing her stars. So welcome, Molly. It's lovely to have you here, and thank you for doing this on a public holiday in the States, when you should be, I don't know, going out and buying your fireworks, or I don't know, preparing your barbecues, or whatever happens on 4th of July. But thank you so much for giving up some time to do this. It's lovely to have you.
Very well.
Now, Molly and I, we've known each other for a while. I think we first met at Great Dixter. How many years ago was that, Molly?
2017. So
wow. Yeah, so pre-COVID. Yeah. And then we've subsequently met at Chanticleer, and then we met very recently back at Dixter, because Molly was there with a group touring from the States, and it luckily and happily coincided with the day that I was teaching there. So we did have some lunch together, and I got to see your mum and dad again, and it was lovely. And I should have been wearing it tonight. You gave me a lovely cap I should have brought it with me. I'm not at home, hence the blue wall behind me. I'm up in Essex, because we have a day tomorrow, one of our live events with John Little. So I'm out and about. Anyway, Molly, welcome back. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you.
I can see you in your studio. I can see the shadow of the fan going round. So that means it's going to be
Yes.
hot there. Is it hot?
It keeps the air conditioning on me
Moving.
and not in the
Okay.
ceiling.
Good. So Molly, since we last spoke to you, so when we last had you on, you were employed at the Botanic Garden. You were there. You've subsequently left. So fill us in a little bit about what's been happening, or is that going to be part of your talk?
It is a part, but I'm happy to kind of set the stage so you're not like,
Yeah,
"Ooh,
do.
what did she do?"
Yeah.
Yes, I worked for the Friends of Birmingham Botanical Gardens, which is the local botanic garden here in Birmingham. And it was the nonprofit that supported the Botanical Gardens, which is owned and operated by the city of Birmingham. So I was kind of the horticulture and design glue between the Friends and our resources and the city, and kind of help steer future development there. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the major projects that I worked on there that give you a window into gardening in the South. But then last July, so almost exactly a year ago, um, I went into my boss and I was just sobbing, and I was like, I need to turn in my notice. Like, I know this is the next right step, but I just was heartbroken to leave, but I just knew it was the next right thing. And he was like, I'm not making you do this, um, but I just knew it was the next right thing for me to keep having my hands in the dirt like I want. And so made the step to create my own, I call it a garden studio. And my tagline, it's called Roots and Ramblings, is the name of my studio, which started out as the name of my blog in college when I just was getting to do all these incredible internships and traveling everywhere with horticulture. And then when it came time to name my studio, I was like, I think it still fits, because at the heart of my studio, what I hope I do is my tagline is cultivating gardens and gardeners. So I love to not just focus on the garden and the design, but also the person that we're creating the garden for, and equipping them to engage and have a relationship with their garden. So
Great.
I was talking to a British audience. They're kind of like, well, of course, you would garden a garden, but in the South, it's kind of a different culture that I'll speak to. So it's been a fun kind of niche to try and carve out for myself.
Well, it's nice to see you a year down the line, because we had tea and cake at Chelsea last year on
Yes.
the King's Road, and you were talking about this big leap, the big move, the big change, and going out on your own. And it's lovely now to see you sort of, busy, thriving, and doing such wonderful and varied things. So that was, yeah, it's lovely to know that it's all worked out well. It's
Well,
really
and
good.
everyone told me how brave I was. Looking back, I'm like,
Oh.
I don't know that I was brave. I think maybe I didn't know what I was getting into. So ignorance is bliss. But it's been an incredible ride. And
Fantastic.
yeah.
Yeah. So, should we start your presentation? Do you want to do
Yes.
screen share, and we'll have a look and see what you've got to tell us about Southern Gardens?
Yes. Go ahead and play. Everyone see?
Yeah, that's lovely. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Noel and Annie, for having me back. It's always fun for me when I pull together these presentations, because it helps me reflect. Sometimes you're just in the grind and you're doing things, and you forget to kind of take stock of what you've done. And I think every time I pull one of these together, I just think about how lucky I am to be in the world of gardens. I really do just feel so privileged to wake up and do what I do every day. So thank you for having me back. And I hope to kind of give you a window into possibly a very different part of the world than where you live. But I hope that there's lots of takeaways for how you can approach your own garden no matter where you are. So like Annie said, I'm in Alabama, and when I get to the part talking about my work at the gardens in my studio now, I'll give you a little bit more details about Alabama. But I wanted to start with, I love starting with this picture, because a lot of times I get asked, how did you get interested in gardens? And for some people, they can think about like, oh, it was with my grandmother. I spent time, pruning her roses with her. The first time I planted a seed and germinated it. There's just like kind of those childhood magical memories that lock you into something. And for me, I grew up about 30 minutes outside of Birmingham. in a much more rural part of the state. And we had 40 acres and we had a lake, as you see here. I'm the middle of 3 girls. We're all really close in age. So they are just my best friends growing up. And my dad just loved the outdoors. His dad was an outdoorsman. And so my mom would kind of send us out the door every day with our 2 border collies and our Jack Russell Terrier, and we would just play in the woods all day. And it's really, when I look back, I'm like, we were approaching nature and the world around us with our imaginations, which is what garden creating is. And so I think even then, even though, we were playing Narnia in the woods, we really were almost creating a garden of our own making, even as children. And I don't know why that like transformed my life. My sisters were out there playing with me, and they both have had very different career paths. But for me, that really is where it began. So even as, my studies have taken me kind of all over the world, there is still this, young Molly in the canoe, tromping through the creeks and playing in the woods, that has never really left me. And so there was another very formative memory for me. My family is a long-standing Auburn family. If you come to the great state of Alabama, pretty soon you'll be asked to choose allegiances between the University of Alabama and Auburn University. And if you are wise, you'll see the light. And Auburn is just a great university. And I chose to go there and study horticulture. And one of the summers they offered a study abroad trip. So that was my first time coming over the pond and coming to England. And we studied at Pershore, which is this little horticultural college in the Midlands in England. And it was just the most phenomenal 6 weeks of my life. And one of my favorite parts was they would just load us up into these vans and take us off to these gardens. We never had any idea where we were going. We kind of like show up and they'd be like, all right, be back at the van in this amount of time. And one of those places was Rousham. And so at this time, as a student, I kind of was maybe thinking about landscape architecture for graduate school, but I was really just falling so deeply in love with plants. I was like, oh, I think I'm going to do my master's in horticulture. I was just so dead set on the plant part. But then it was at Rousham, it was particularly this part of the garden where there's like this little path off to the side. You almost think like, am I supposed to go down there? And it feels like you have this rope attached to your chest and it's pulling you through, and you're pushed in and you're released and you're pulled back in and released. And there's all these little scenes that are set up for you, like the octagonal pool, and you can stand under the grotto. And almost every single time I've been back to Rousham, it's been raining, and it's just this magical experience, how light filters through and there's this rill of water that pulls you through. And there's not really, if you read the old head gardener's notes, it sounds like there used to be more flowering plants here, but now we're kind of left to the structural bits and just how space is composed and the choreography of your experience moving through the garden. I just had this moment where I was like, I want to create places like this. I want to make people feel the way that I feel in this space. And so that was kind of this memory that locked in for me. And even as I was standing here in this garden, I thought, it was pulling on my childhood memories of the woods, the piney woods of Alabama. Even though I'm on a different continent, there was something about this garden that like touched down into some memories that were in me. And I just realized in that moment how deeply powerful gardens were, and that different people experience them in different ways, but that there was a designer, that it was choreographed in a certain way to make me feel a certain way. And that was when I decided I wanted to pursue landscape architecture. And there was one other experience. I interned at a garden in Delaware called Winter Tour, and it's a woodland garden, 65-acre woodland garden on a 1,000-acre estate, has beautiful fields that you look out from the garden down into. But I lived with 4 other interns in this little house in the garden, and every morning we would wake up and work in the garden all day, and then I would normally take my dinner and go sit on a bench and watch the sunset. And it was that summer I realized, okay, there's something different about when I'm working in a garden. It's different than when I just visit a garden. I've visited gardens and had very powerful experiences, but like this, living in a garden for 4 months and working in it every day, it's doing something different to me. And that's when I kind of began to realize like, oh, a garden is like a layering of all these different moments. I got to see Winter Tour through every time of day as the light changed, as the fog lifted in the morning over the fields. I got to see it in full spring bloom in May. And then in August when I left, it was transitioning kind of more in like its descent into autumn. So the seasonality of gardens, hearing kids laughing from the children's garden, just kind of like echoing all the way through. They're just all these little moments is what I began to call them. And I realized that a garden at its core, it's a relationship. So it's not just about, that picture perfect moment that you might see in a magazine. Truly great gardens, it's almost like a friendship. It's this layering of different moments over time. So after that experience, I had decided to continue on into landscape architecture for graduate work. And when I returned, we were tasked with completing our thesis for grad school. And so that's kind of your chance as a student to place your flag in the ground and kind of say, like, this is what my shtick is going to be. And so I was like maybe 23. I was kind of like, what do I know? But I just was like, there's something about the garden, and no one talks about gardens in the wider profession of landscape architecture. It seemed to always be about these big civic and public spaces, which are so valuable and so important. But I, in my thesis, began to argue, like, well, what about those very personal moments that come from a garden, a very intimate connection to a place, a very personal connection to a place? Does that have space in the discourse when we're talking about sustainability? And I thought it does. And so that's what I'm gonna do my thesis on. So I just called my thesis the Garden Project. And you can see here, I began realizing, like, oh, gardens at their core, they're this tension between man and nature. We're kind of pushing and pulling against each other, and it's this meeting of the two. Um, but gardens are also a tension of light and shadow, and times you want to move and pause, and structural firm bits, and then there's the parts that are ephemeral and ebb and flow through time. And so there's just all this juxtaposition of different things that come together in the garden. That's what I began to wrestle with in my thesis. So here you can see all these iterations of how I was trying to figure out how I was tasked with this little parking lot in Auburn to test my ideas on. So I began to think, like, what are all the different ways that you could move through this place, and what could this parking lot feel through the season? So I was really just grappling with, like, what can a garden do and why does it matter? And so I began making these collages, because I was like, these photo perfect perspectives aren't touching on what I'm wanting to touch on. I'm wanting to communicate, what does that garden feel like? Not just like photorealistic, what's it going to look like? And then I began to do these charcoal drawings and graphite drawings, and I was trying to play around with, like, oh, how do you graphically and two-dimensionally represent how a garden might feel? And so then, you get to the end of grad school, and I didn't feel like my ideas were fully baked or ready. And I was just kind of like, all right, I have to turn something in and I need to graduate. And so you kind of just hit pause and then turn it in. But it seems as if my whole career has been a continuation of me working out all these things I was wrestling with in grad school. And I feel very fortunate that straight out of grad school, I was awarded a fellowship. It's a partnership through the Garden Club of America and the Royal Horticulture Society. And so it was just this amazing experience where I was chosen and then got to kind of tell them my interests and places I might want to work. And then for 10 months, I had this amazing program where I was moving around to different gardens every 6 to 8 weeks. So that's when mine and Annie's paths crossed. And so today I just want to touch on kind of two places that they all impacted my work as a designer, but there were two that really stuck with me and influenced a lot of my work post fellowship. But you'll see here, I started at Wisley, and then went to Sheffield and worked with Nigel Dennett and James Hitchmo, and then was at the Eden Project. Spent the longest stint at Great Dixter, which is where I met Annie, and then headed north to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. Came down for the Chelsea Flower Show and worked the show that whole week, and then did a stint at Kew, and then finished up at Tresco Abbey on the Isles of Scilly. So you can see here, there's a huge range of different types of gardens I was working in, even just different climates between, Cornwall and Edinburgh, very, very different types of places to garden. And even just like a scientific institution like a Kew or an Edinburgh versus a Great Dixter, which is just art and flair and just beautifulness all around you. Both have important things to offer to the garden world, but very different. So feel very lucky. I got to stick my finger in a lot of pies. But it's great being an intern because it's kind of like sampling all the ice cream. And then I kind of got to decide which vein I wanted to stay in. The first one I wanted to touch on was working with Nigel Dunnett at Sheffield. So I was there for about 6 weeks and got to sit in on a lot of Nigel's classes and James's classes on planting design, and also took a class on maintenance. And so Nigel and James are both landscape architects, but they're also ecologists. And so my horticulture brain, as I was trained as a horticulturist, you're kind of taught like, this is when you prune certain things and this is how you do it. And here's the proper time to fertilize. And it's all very, these are the evergreen things that you use around the foundation of a house. And it's all very like neatly tied up in a bow. And what I really loved about Nigel and James is they kind of were like, well, why do we have to do it that way? Is there another way? Is there a way that we could do it that actually is more beneficial to people and to the environment? And so Nigel took me all around Sheffield to a lot of his projects, and I got to visit a couple of his projects further afield. But one that really stuck with me was this Great Green project in the center of Sheffield, where I think there was another road added outside of Sheffield where they could eliminate one of these lanes through the middle of Sheffield. And so Nigel was commissioned, I think got some money from the EU to change one of those lanes into a bioswale. And so he walked me through, and just the way he would talk about plants being in relationship to each other. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of the CSR theory, where you have competitors, stress tolerators, and ruderal species, and they all have different strategies for multiplying themselves, and they all relate to the plants around them in different ways. It was the first time I was hearing plants talked about in that way. And I thought, this is just so much better than how we do things a lot in the South, because in the South, we're very heavy on woody ornamentals. And your standard landscape, what you'll see is a bunch of encore azaleas in a sea of mulch, and you've got your irrigation, and it's on a Bluetooth timer on your cell phone, and bada bing, you're done. And that's what everyone's dads did in their yards. So everyone buys their first house and that's what they start doing. And I just thought, we're leaving a lot of possibility on the table. Like, look how rich and beautiful this is. And what really stuck with me with Nigel is he cared just as much about it being beautiful as he did it being functional. It wasn't just about the number of insects it attracted. It was also about the people that were going to be walking past this at work. And the day that he took me there, I went home. I was living at a little Airbnb with a couple, and the wife asked me, what I had done that day. And she's a social worker in Sheffield. And I told her about that project, and she had no idea about Nigel and his work, but she was like, she's got tears in her eyes. And she was like, Molly, the courthouse is right by that project that you're talking about. I can't tell you how many times I've been in just a really hard, heavy trial with a child that's in a really hard situation. And we walk out and see how beautiful it is, and it just gives us hope. And she's like, you don't know how much that matters. And that's when I thought, like, okay, this is like, ecologically, this is doing a lot, but wow, this like deeply emotionally matters for people that are living in cities. So that really stuck with me, of just how powerful and functional planting design can really be. And then the other spot that really impacted me was Great Dixter. And so I had this article from this garden design magazine it was an article on Great Dixter. It was pinned above my bulletin board all of grad school. So when I was there at 2, 3 in the morning, I would look up and be like, okay, this is why I'm doing this. Just remind yourself. But I showed up at Dixter, you've seen all of the pictures in the magazines. But I showed up and it was the dead of January, and it was very, very cold for someone from Alabama. And I thought, oh no, have I made a horrible mistake? I'm showing up here and it's like very, very cold. Am I going to learn anything? And it was the most magical time to be at Great Dixter, because I got to see how the stage was set for just the absolute theater that it is, that you get to experience during the growing season. But even in winter, there were things happening in the garden. And even just the pot display of conifers in front of the house, you come to spring and everything becomes bulbs, and then it changes out. There's a dwarf conifers again on the Lutchen steps, but might be cactuses another week that you come. And when I was just at Great Dixter with the garden tour that I was helping lead. It was poppies. And so I just loved how dynamic Great Dixter was. I hadn't ever been in a garden that was so rich in its depth, and it was always changing. It felt like every week there was something new that you could be taking in it. It never felt like it had just arrived and was staying the way that it was. And there's these beautiful meadows that wrap around the whole garden. When I was just there, it was, orchid time in the meadow, and the buttercups and the daisies. It just is magical. And you have these stiff topiaries that are clipped. There's cotinus and yews, and then there's the meadow that ebbs and flows all around it. And these are some people from my group, but you can just see just the smiles on their faces. They're looking at these meadows. And I just had so many people ask me, like, can we do this? Like, can we have meadows? And I just was like, yes. I think it's just not what we do. And I think at Dixter, it was the first time that I found myself just kind of as a reflex, always saying like, oh, that's so cool, but we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do that. And I started asking myself, is it that we can't do certain things, or is it that we just don't? So that kind of stayed in my brain. And one of the major projects we worked on at Dixter was the high garden, and we would cover it in the boards at night so that the ground wouldn't freeze and we could continue digging the next day. But we ripped everything out, completely redesigned the different drifts that were going in. This was it by spring. But we were lifting a lot of those perennials and dividing them and taking them down to the nursery to propagate them for the nursery. And so this was a working garden. It wasn't just about, it being beautiful and having as many visitors as it could. It was also about propagating and growing these really beautiful, rare heirloom varieties of plants and getting them into other people's gardens. I learned about mixing compost or mixing potting soils and the different things that you need to think about when you do that. This was the compost heap behind the hedges. That there's this rickety old ladder. You had to like hold your bucket on your back and then walk up, and there were some rungs missing. So I'm not sure it was health and safety approved, but you would dump your bits on the top. And then there was these magical plant fairs. And so Fergus would invite nurserymen from all over Europe and the UK who were growing just really specialty, interesting things that you can't just find in any big box store. So I just loved how outward facing this garden was, and how much they tried to use their influence to spotlight things that were really important. And so this was a design I had done for a landscape architect before I moved to England, and it's an AutoCAD. It's very precise, and you can generate exact quantities, what you need to do. But I just loved at Dixter, we were just flipping over pages of paper. And I think this was a design that Fergus did for the Peacock Garden. You're just kind of just brainstorming. It doesn't have to be so exact and perfect. And then you're laying it out in the field. And Fergus was always curious. That was one thing I also learned, was just stay curious. And so he was doing a muscari trial while I was there, and he planted all these different varieties of grape hyacinth in pots. And then he went around and he was like, all right, everyone say, like, what's your favorite one and why? And we had to it trained me to have an eye. Like, it wasn't just enough to plant some muscari, but like, what color blue is it? How does it present its foliage when it's coming up? How does it go over? How does it compete with the other bulbs around it or the other perennials around it? So there was just this layered thinking that I began to be pushed towards. And one of the things that really stayed with me too was just the heart of, Fergus has been there since Chris Lloyd brought him on decades ago. And I was walking behind him, following him somewhere for him to give me another task. And he just patted this little euonymus and said, like, how you doing, old girl? And I just loved that, because him saying that just came from a heart that loved this place so much. And at Dixter, I think I also realized, like, oh, gardens really are about people. And in this picture, you have people represented. Michael's from Germany. There's Sarah and Dean from other parts of England. Lisa from Sweden. Coralie, who's still there. Motoko, who's from Japan. So it was just like the whole world kind of came to Great Dixter, and you're getting to learn about where they come from and how they do things. And I became known as Molly from Alabama. You can see I'm sporting my overalls. Love a good pair of overalls. So I think it was at Dixter, funny enough, that I decided I think I want to go back to Alabama. Because Dixter was a garden that was so of that place. You couldn't move it 2 feet in either direction and it'd be the same place. It just was so anchored in that house and in its history and in the high weald of East Sussex that I realized the beauty of going back to a place that you know and love and really digging your heels in and creating a place that's very, very of that place. And so that's when, little Molly in the canoe was creeping back up. I just felt this pull to go back home to Alabama. So I think what the fellowship gave me, what I like to say is it gave me the view from the compost heap. So this is the view from the top of that compost heap. We'd have to crawl to the top of it, Dixter. And, visitors don't get that view. And when you're a gardener and you're actively working in the garden, that's when you get the view kind of metaphorically of the garden in that way. And I just will always be grateful for that 10 months where I got to kind of step behind the scenes and sink my hands in the soil, not all over these places, but alongside a lot of really great, amazing gardeners who taught me so much. And I put these pictures in because my last placement was at Tresco Abbey on the Scilly Isles, which if you want a garden that just leans hardcore into microclimate, there's normally no frost on Tresco, so they can grow things that you just can't grow anywhere else in England because of the what's it called? The Gulf Stream that comes up and warms it. There was a horrible ice frost in 1987 that they still talk about there, but it killed, I think, like 75% of the garden. But when you're there, you feel like you're in New Zealand or Australia or South Africa. It just is like this otherworldly place. So I think it would be a shame if at Tresco they had tried to create a British cottage garden, an English cottage garden, when they have this incredible microclimate that they can lead into. And then this was my very last night on the fellowship before I was, taking the boat back to the mainland and flying home. And it was on the 4th of July. So all my friends there at Tresco took me to the pub and we had a burger and they let me sing the national anthem. And it was just one of my favorite memories. So I always remember that on the 4th of July. So that takes me back to Alabama. So I've wanted to give those of you who aren't familiar with Alabama a little bit of context. Gardening in the States is just so different than in England. I envy just that y'all can go to all these master classes and, there's differences in gardening in Cornwall versus Essex and things like that. But for the majority, it's a relatively smaller country and it's just a very tight-knit community. Whereas in the States, it's just such a massive country with such varying climates and regions that it's very regional. So there's a lot that happens in the garden world in the Northeast and on the West Coast. But I really felt this draw to come back to Alabama and bring some of the ideas I had drawn from all these places that I had worked and bring them to Alabama. And you'll see we're right above Florida to the west of Georgia, but to the east of Mississippi. And Alabama is the 4th most biodiverse state out of all 50 states, which is remarkable. Birmingham sits smack in the middle, and it's the biggest city in Alabama. Our capital is actually Montgomery, which is south, but Birmingham, the foothills of the Appalachians come down into the top right corner of Alabama from Georgia and Tennessee. And Birmingham is in what's called the Ridge and Valley. So people are very surprised when they come to Birmingham. I don't know what people picture in their minds, but it's an incredibly hilly city and it's very, very green. So the main part of the city is down the valley. It's called Jones Valley. So we are actually a post-Civil War city because the soil here was horrible for farming. There were actually 4 different Native American tribes that used Jones Valley as their hunting ground, but no one really stayed put here because you weren't able to grow crops because the soil was so rocky and clay. And so, but there is a lot of water in Birmingham. And then you have this huge mountain called Red Mountain, and it's called Red Mountain because it has a seam of iron ore. And so Birmingham is called the Magic City because they say it kind of appeared overnight, because they discovered that it possessed everything that you needed to make steel. So it has iron ore in Red Mountain. It has coal that was mined out of the western part of Birmingham, had water. We have tons of rivers and creeks running through Birmingham. And it had limestone. So I don't even think Pittsburgh has all of those things in one spot. So we became known as the Pittsburgh of the South. All these iron forgeries are popping up, steel mills. And so it was a very industrial city. And a lot of people also know Birmingham because of our civil rights history, which is not a great spot on, it's not a good spot on our history, but it is a part of our history, and it's still is something that we don't want to wash over and forget about. But in the 60s, a lot of the white people that were living down in the city, they made this massive cut through the mountain, and that's when a lot of they called it white flight. White people moved to the suburbs. And so looking at this picture, there's kind of like a very sad part of our history that's associated with it, but it's also tells a story of our rich geological heritage. And I think Birmingham has come a long way since the 60s. But Alabama is also where was I going with that? You can throw a rock. So the geology, you can see to the left here in this map, there's seen like all these little fingers of different kinds of rock moving through. So that means our soil is very different. You can throw a rock and you'll be working somewhere different, different kind of soil. So it's really fun as a garden designer to try and design things that engage with that. And one of the huge reasons why we're the fourth most biodiverse state is because of our water. So when Alabama became a state in 1819, our state seal actually, states kind of were trying to advertise themselves like, move here. And the big thing for Alabama was all of our rivers that could get you to the port of Mobile, and it could get your crops out to the wider world very, very quickly. So our water is a huge asset for the state. We also are very biodiverse in things. We love snakes. We love what they do. I always say, I just don't want to see them doing what they do. But I envy England. You'll have like 3 snakes, maybe like 1 that's maybe venomous. We have all the heavy hitters in venomous snakes. So does make gardening a little bit more perilous. But we have I think we have 144 endemic species, which means species that are only found within the state lines of Alabama, wild populations. And a lot of people know us for our Cahaba lily, which is a lily that only grows in the shoals of Alabama because it needs to be able to get light. So it has to grow in these like shallow pools of water. But it has to have moving water moving over it. So there's only a couple of select places and rivers in Alabama where this lily can grow. So here's my selfie with a Cahaba lily. So we took our interns at the gardens to see them every summer and would tromp them through these old longleaf pine forests. And so when I made a decision to come back to Alabama, I will say I made a decision to come back, and I came back with I like to say, well, I don't like to, I wish that I'd come back with a better attitude, but I didn't. I came back with a very bad attitude because I was just like, what is going on in Alabama? There's nothing interesting. I was just living the dream in England, and what am I going to do here? And I very quickly had to eat my words because I was offered this position at Birmingham Botanical Gardens where I got to seamlessly blend, my horticulture training, design training. And I began just rubbing shoulders with all these incredible gardeners and people that had been here for decades and knew the city so well, knew our plants so well. And I just began to see like, okay, I came back with probably a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. And I'm eating a little bit of humble pie now. My job at the gardens, I came on as the garden assessment project leaders. There are 26 different individual gardens that made up the Birmingham Botanical Gardens. It's about 65 acres. And my job was to understand the original design intent for all the different gardens that made up the gardens, and then assess whether that garden was on track, whether it was reaching that design intent, and come up with a development plan to kind of, get it back on track, or maybe the design intent needed to change because it was 2020 and we need to think differently than we did in 1970. So that inevitably meant that I was working on a huge scale range. So one of my first jobs was helping to kind of spearhead what we called our master plan refresh. We'd had a huge, very ambitious master plan done in 2010, but it kind of wasn't done in a way where it was feasible for us to raise the money to actually accomplish it. And so we brought in Cindy Tyler from Terra Design in Pittsburgh, and she just is phenomenal and was able to kind of come alongside us and hear our goals and help us strategize. So there were times where I was sitting with the board having these huge conversations about our 20-year vision for the gardens on a master plan level. I was taking Cindy out to our wild places throughout the state to help give her a taste of what we were hoping to showcase at the botanical gardens. So this is Bankhead National Forest, the Sipsey Wilderness, which is about an hour outside of Birmingham. But just, you'll see again, tons of rock, tons of water, and a ton of diversity. So we had kind of like master plan scale, but then I was also doing like planting design for a lot of our smaller gardens. So this one's called the Little Ones Memory Garden. It's a garden that was built in honor to remember little ones that had been lost either before like in utero or in the first year of their life. And there's a volunteer group that comes one Saturday a month, and a lot of them have lost infants at a very young age. And so it's kind of like a support group. And every year they host this walk that is in honor and celebrates the lives of these little ones. And so this was kind of a weird garden. It had these weird concrete walls and it had all these really spiky plants. And I was kind of tasked with, how do we design this garden for hope? And so we decided to kind of have a showstopper plant in each season. And the big crescendo comes in October when the Ryan's pink mums bloom, and that's just in time for the walk. So there are things like that where I'm sitting down with these women that have and families that have lost little ones and hearing why this garden means so much to them and what they hope it communicates. And I'm doing a planting design on a much smaller scale. So it was a really fun job to have. We did this new sign at the intersection, and we wanted it to, I kind of was like, what if we did all native plants? Most botanical gardens, they'd have a huge annual display out front. And I was like, what if we make a statement that it's only plants that are native to the state of Alabama, and it's going to look nice and intentional, but this sign isn't a sign that could be anywhere else at any other botanical garden in the US. So in the spring, there's the Phlox subulata that's right there on the front that cascades over the wall. Then in summer, it's the black-eyed Susans that come to life, and you see this Carex cherokeensis that's under a black gum, and there's a serviceberry on the other side. And then you have the white cloud muhly grass that lights up in the fall. And so I just love this so much because it was kind of like stepping our toe into a bigger capital project, but also making a statement about who we were, that it was of this place.
We hope that you are enjoying this recording from Garden Masterclass's Thursday Garden Chat program. We started doing this in April 2020 during the first COVID lockdown, when we did it 5 days a week for 2 months, which was a wonderful experience. Since then, we've carried on doing it just for one session a week. We have always done this as a public service. We initially started it as a morale booster for the garden and landscape industry during a very difficult time, and we've so loved doing it that we've carried on doing this. But our presenters give their time for free. We give our time for free. We do incur costs, administrative, technical, and sometimes for support staff, and we would very much appreciate the odd donation to help us keep going and help keep this a free service, which we'd very much like to do. So please go to our homepage, and down at the bottom there's a donate button, and we'll be very grateful. Thank you.
And I think I talked to my last masterclass chat about this, so I'll just go quickly through the perennial border. But kind of that Dixter part of my heart was like, I need a border. Like, I need to be working with perennials. And in the South, Actually, my laptop is sitting on top of a manual of woody landscape plants, which is like our Bible in the South. It's written by Michael Durr, who's a professor at the University of Georgia. Um, there's just so much in the South that revolves around woody plants. And actually, when I was in England, there was this huge push to like, remember woody plants. It's not all about herbaceous plants. And I just found that so funny because in the South, I was like, remember herbaceous plants, don't forget about them. They add so much to a landscape. So it's kind of in this like, ugh, how am I gonna push the envelope on this? And I was down in the archives at the Botanical Gardens and I stumbled across this plan by a professor at Clemson University, which is in South Carolina. And it was done in the 1980s for one of our gardens at BBG that was called the Southern Living Garden. And it was created by Southern Living magazine, which is a huge deal in the South. My grandmother always had the most recent issue of Southern Living on her coffee table. Every good Southern woman subscribes to Southern Living. It's where you get your recipes. And they used to have just an army of horticulturists on staff. And they designed this garden at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, because the magazine is based out of Birmingham, to showcase what you could do in your own home garden. And this is John Floyd, who's kneeling there in the blue shirt. He was the editor-in-chief of Southern Living for a long time. And when I showed up at BBG, he was on the board and just kind of took me under his wing and taught me so much about the history of the gardens and about gardening in the South. But this is what the border used to look like back in like the 80s and 90s, and filled with color and different textures. And then when I arrived, it was this. And the real kicker for me was I'm sure in the UK, you all have heard of our lovely gift to the universe, The Bachelor, which is a reality TV show, all these girls competing for one man's heart. But when they get to hometowns, they go and he gets to travel to their hometowns. So in one of the seasons, there's a girl from Birmingham on it, and they met up at the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and this was in the background. And I immediately went to my boss. It was on national TV, and I was like, we've got to do something. I need money. We've got to do, like, that cannot be coleus any longer. And so we began going down the road of redesigning this border and kind of bringing back the spirit of what was there in the 1980s. So across from that is what's called the Winter Garden. And so part of this garden is trying to showcase, okay, in the South, you can keep gardening all through winter. Like, our ground doesn't freeze. There are some cold days, but it's relatively mild. And so this is Lenten roses that are all in bloom, with Cornus moss that blooms in February. But then across from it is the border. So that's supposed to kind of pick up in February and carry you all the way until the first killing frost, which is typically at the end of November or the beginning of December. But I went through the whole plan, every single perennial, and I went around to different nurserymen in the area, different gardeners, and I asked them, like, tell me about each one of these cultivars, or perennials, are there better ones now? What's your experience with it? Because I realized I didn't know a whole lot, but I knew who to go to for the information. So then we cleared out the border. I left behind the bits that I felt like were worth maintaining. There's John down there helping me plant. This big box truck showed up that morning and we offloaded, and I set out all the plants. So I got my bamboo sticks like we had done at Dixter, and I laid out the different swaths and then had volunteers planting behind me. And this was the first year. So I look back at this and I think, okay, it's better than the coleus, but we're still not there. So I drew out this plan. I had kind of a rough plan when I laid it all out, but I actually drew out how it went into the ground. And then these are all my notes as I went through the season. I think this was actually just one day when I went out there. So I had pages and pages of notes. And then come 2020, the garden shut down, but I was still able to go in. And so I used that time with no visitors to just completely overhaul the border. We moved things around. We weren't able to have our spring plant sale, so I kind of had access to all these amazing perennials that didn't get sold at our plant sale. And I learned so much that year just from being able to grow things and see them change and how they worked. And so got to write this article for our magazine, and I titled it, To Know Them, You Must Grow Them. So that really has become my mantra. It's really hard to design things that you've never grown before. But part of gardening in the South is that we get very, very extreme weather. And this was last March. So this was 4 years on into the creation of the border. And I had felt like I had finally fine-tuned everything for the specific light conditions. And I showed up one Monday and an over 100-year-old oak had fallen um, in front of the border, completely changing the light conditions. It took out probably 5 or 6 other trees with it when it came down. This is one of the gardeners, Vinny, standing next to the trunk of the tree. So that's part of gardening is things happen, you can't control it, and you have to adjust. And so we chopped up the tree, used the wood for different things. But I remember taking this picture because the tree didn't hit the border. It came within inches, but none of the plants were taken out, and the tulips just came up and kept blooming. And there's like a massive oak tree that's fallen down there in the distance there. But I thought, you know what? That's the hope of that we see in a garden, is that the seasons keep on clicking and going no matter what. So you move on. The next was the Call Wildflower Garden. I'll go quickly through this one. But we had Thomas Rayner come and do a plan where we could, and this is our wildflower garden, so it's all native species. And he did this report. And so he zoned off the garden and kind of told us a different strategy for each garden, but then it was up to us to kind of take that and translate it into the implications. And so I began what I call the phenology project. So every week for a couple of years, I would go up there and track all the different species and what they were doing each week of the year, whether they were in bloom or in bud or had leaf color. Because I was really trying to understand what's going on in this garden, what do our native plants have to offer. And then I began researching, like, okay, we're so diverse. Okay, we have one species of liatris in the wildflower garden, but we actually have 10 species that are native to our state. You know, could we be growing all 10 and showing people the diversity of our state in a more holistic way? Same with Coreopsis. I did these little drawings so I could visualize how tall they get, what their growth habit is, when their bloom time is, what types of places they grow. This is Asclepias, the milkweed. So you can tell even just in Alabama, there's like so much diversity, even just within one genus. But the garden was completely overgrown. It was taken over by smilax, just covering things. So we began editing. So this was our first pass getting all of that out. We began to take stock of where exactly trees were and what needed to be removed. And I had one of our volunteers as a retired architect, so he was making all these maps for us. But there was a lot of good things in wrong places. So like that Magnolia macrophylla that's there in the middle of a meadow. It doesn't grow in the middle of a meadow. It grows in the depths of our woodlands. And so it had to come down. We had to clear out a lot of junk. We solarized the meadow using plastic to try and kill a lot of the weed seeds. But I actually walked up there yesterday and we had kind of redone the hardscape and then replanted a lot of the meadows. So now it feels like, you know, you're in the heart of the city, but you could be in a glade somewhere in Alabama. One of the most exciting projects was this savanna. This was a part of the garden that completely been forgotten. We got a mulch mower in there and created a savanna. So we mulched all that up, had to cut down a lot of trees that had come up over time. And then hand dug out all the smilax with a ton of different volunteers. These are summer interns. This is how big some of the smilax tubers and wisteria roots were. So this is it kind of cleared out, and then this is it. That was it yesterday. And it's just amazing what can be done with some elbow grease. So, and I actually had someone ask me, like, you know, the savanna and the Call Wildflower Garden, it's cool, but like, we don't have savannas in Alabama. And I was like, oh, we do. They've been erased almost from our landscape, just from development, or when you subtract fire. A lot of these ecosystems are dependent on fire. Then a lot of trees can grow and they shade them out. And so this has been an incredible educational tool for, like, oh, actually savannas and meadows used to cover our state. We used to have a ton of grasslands. It wasn't just woodlands. But it's just this incredible garden where there's parts of it that you want to move through and see what's around the bend of those stairs. And there's parts where you want to pause and take in a view. And this was really my takeaway from this project working at the gardens, it was Thomas in his report. He said, design is not a singular vision set to paper. It's 1,000 small decisions and actions we want to elevate here. We believe that good design emanates from the site, not from a cubicle, and good installation and management follow a big vision, not reactionary decisions in the field. So that really is the posture of a gardener. It's not just what's on an AutoCAD set to paper, that gardens change over time. Trees fall, things don't work that you think will. Light changes. You know, we had a very historic frost in Christmas of 22 that killed a lot of things here in Alabama. That kind of frost won't happen probably again for another 100 years, but it happened. So how do we adapt from it? So I love that Thomas in his studio, and what he kind of taught me through our work with him was, you know, research, observe, make a move, watch what happens, and respond. Observe, respond. And it's just this cycle of observing and responding. So I'm gonna quickly touch on my studio, Roots and Ramblings. This is a sweet little watercolor where I'm sitting in that little house right here. That's my studio in my parents' backyard. It's what was our playhouse growing up. So it's really funny that I get to sit here and imagine these new worlds and places for people, and a place where, you know, my sisters and I played house growing up and used our imaginations in different ways. And that's my dog, Lady Bell, that's in the front there. Her birthday is also the 4th of July. So Lady Liberty and Lady Bell. But this has just been the most wonderful adventure of kind of striking out on my own. And I really want to bring a gardening spirit to the South. Is really deeply, deeply entrenched in what I call yard culture. So typically when you buy a house, you get your evergreen shrubs around the foundation, you put your crepe myrtle on the corner of your house, and you get your nice, beautiful turf done, and you fertilize it when you're supposed to. You get your lawnmower and your weed eater, and call it a day. And I kind of feel like my role is to, and it's not that people, you know, they just don't, there's not really anything different that's been modeled for them. But at the gardens, I began rubbing shoulders with a lot of our volunteers who were just like such incredible gardeners, had been gardening for decades and decades. They loved plants so much, but they were so intimidated by the design, and they knew that their garden could be so much more than it was if they had a strategy or a framework to work within. So kind of the niche I've carved out for myself is being able to come alongside people who are true hands in the dirt gardeners and give them a strategy for what they can do in their own garden. So sometimes I'm doing full scale plans like this one, or like this couple. They're around my age, have this cute little house in a historic part of Birmingham that has your very typical boxwoods. And they came to me and were like, we want something different. All the boxwoods can go. We want it to be all native plants. And so we designed this incredible garden that ripped up all this concrete and created this flagstone path. You know, the wife's dad is in a wheelchair because of an illness, and so he still needs to be able to get to the backyard. But I was like, oh, what if there's a live edge and we plant the whole edge with all these beautiful shady perennials, and we have service berries that bloom and then get fall color and have berries, and they'll be right out your living room windows. And it's just so much more than having this concrete flume down the back of your driveway. This was their yard that was mostly grass. And so these were some of my first sketches where I said, like, let's frame the lawn. Like, your daughter's going to want some lawn to play in, but what if we played around with the hardscape and kind of broke it up, and then had a bird sanctuary there in the back, and we studied berry phenology and what all things produce berries through all different times of the year. And I made these plant palettes for them, kind of explain like these will be the structural plants, these will be the different plants that bloom and have interest in different parts of the season. And this is the possibilities for the bird sanctuary. And it ends up in this CAD plan that I can then hand off to a contractor. But there's so much more happening there than what happens in CAD. And so we miss a lot when we just do things in CAD. But so my final projects I'll talk about are some of my planting projects that I've gotten the chance to do. So I was approached by a couple of people that were like, we hear you know about native plants. And one of my clients, she said, we want a meadow. And so it's one of those things where you say yes before you actually know how you're going to do it. And so I figured out how to source all the plants, and I staged them at my parents' house and kept them watered. And this was Janet's garden where she and her husband want a meadow, and it was just weeds. And she had kind of thrown some zinnia seeds out there, but it was hard, compacted clay. Nothing was really going on there. Nothing would germinate. And so I said, Janet, we have a soil problem. So I did this whole report for her where I outlined, like, these are the weeds, the types of weeds that I'm seeing. Here's what those weeds tell us about the soil. And I made a whole plan for what we should do. So we went there in January and we just took a digging fork. We didn't want to till it because that would then settle more and compact it more. We didn't have time to do cover cropping. So I said, let's grab some digging forks. I got Keith, who's one of my friends from the gardens, and we went to town just like cracking the soil and putting compost over it and getting some air and some life back into that soil, so that some roots could get down in there. And then what we did was lay weed paper over the top of it, and we anchored it with firewood, and then we covered it with pine straw for the winter and just let it kind of sit. And it got organisms going back through the soil, got some air in there, got some nutrients. And you can see it worked pretty well. This was it right before we planted out, and really only weeds were popping up along the edges where there had been cracks in the paper. So the weed paper actually was very pleased with. And this was after 18 hours of planting. I forget how many flats of plugs went into the ground, but that went in the ground in May. So that was a really fun project because I thought these are people that don't just want a bed of azaleas. They want to push the boundaries. They want to support pollinators, but they all do want it to be beautiful. They sit in those chairs every morning and drink their coffee, and they wanted color. This was another planting where very different condition. It was in a woodland. And my client, he couldn't get anything to grow here. He had tried grass. He had tried all kinds of different shrubs, but it's a hill, and it was very compacted soil from the construction of the house. And so I proposed to him, like, okay, here's kind of what we want it to feel like. I think it should be canopy trees with a sparkling ground cover of different native perennials and matrix. Here's kind of the species that I'm thinking. We'll have a structural layer, a flowering layer, and then a sedge layer. And what if we do 3 different pockets, one at the top of the hill, one middle of the hill, and one at the bottom of the hill, and we do a matrix of all these different species, and then let's watch it for a year and let's see what works. Before we plant out the whole thing, I'll say, I think there's going to be things that surprise us. There's going to be things that work and go gangbusters. There's going to be things that really don't. And then we can, as we observe, we can build out those pockets until they make one seamless ground cover. So this was kind of my quick little sketch for him. And then we got to work. We remediated the soil. We did mulch up a lot of stuff, and we tilled it just to get rid of some of that compaction. It was good loamy soil to plant in. These are the 3 drifts. And I had a crew helping me. So I got to lay out all the different plugs, and they came behind me and planted them, and then we mulched over. So this was it right after we finished. And then I swung by a week ago, and it's already filled in so much. So this is another one where I feel like I've been given the opportunity to have the posture of a gardener and try something. We're going to observe. And so it's been really special to engage with clients who really value that type of work. They have clients who came to me and said, we want an edible forest. They had this crazy slope in their backyard, and they're like, could it be fruit trees and vegetables and all kinds of things? So, oh, there's supposed to be another picture there. Then I had this other client, and he said, there's weeds. What do we do? And I again said, what if we do this, make it kind of, I was like, I love the rocks. I love the Japanese maple. It's kind of making me think of a Japanese garden. It's framed out this window of your dining room. So what if we amp up the rocks and really make them features? And then we have this sparkling ground cover of different shady perennials going on underneath it that bloom in different times. Oh, sorry, here's the edible forest. So this is going down the slope. And we're going to do interlocking raised beds that will then screen the view they want to view, but not screen the mountain in the distance. That'll be a really fun one. So these are all projects that are in the works, a little isometric I did for them be able to visualize how it will actually feel to like make their way up that hillside. But at the end of the day, what I really love about my studio is getting my hands dirty. This is my trowel after I finished planting Janet's meadow. And then she came out and she just gotten her nails done. And she just was like, Molly, like I was like, take a picture with me. So we got a picture, and it's really those moments where I see the joy that a new planting can bring to someone, that I remember why it is that I do what I do. And Elizabeth Lawrence, this is the quote that I'll end on, was one of the greatest Southern gardeners of all time. She was in North Carolina and wrote prolifically. And in one of her books called Through the Garden Gate, she says, any garden demands as much of its maker as he has to give. But I do not need to tell you, if you are a gardener, that no other undertaking will give you as great of a return for the amount of effort put into it. So I feel like that's kind of the torch I've been given to bear, is that gardens are a lot of work, but it's a relationship, and it's a friendship that grows deeper and deeper with time, and that it's worth it for the end product. So thank you all.
Thank you, Molly. That was wonderful. Do you want to just come out of screen share?
Yes.
And if anyone has any questions, please do see if put them in the chat box. I can't help thinking, Molly, that your childhood running feral in the woods with the dogs and your sisters is very similar to mine in a way. But I was running feral on Exmoor. But what I think that has given you is that confidence to go and travel and absorb and learn. Isn't it wonderful, that freedom as a child to explore, will helps you as an adult. And I've forgotten about your Pershore trip to start with,
Yes.
and that fact that you've covered so much ground and learned so much, and bringing that back to where you are and being allowed to do it, and having clients that will trust you to do those, to change. That's fantastic, isn't it? It's wonderful.
It's been such a privilege. Yeah. Just thinking back to childhood, I think there's a lot of kids that aren't given that freedom. And when I think about what design is, it's really problem solving. So I think as a child, if you have all your problems solved for you and you're not forced to solve some of them,
you don't know how to do it.
You don't have the courage to do it when you get older. And so I a lot of times tell people with their plants, in the South, people just want to make sure that everything's getting irrigated. And I was like, I always say, like, it's like parenting. Make the plant babies do hard things when they're young. They'll make their roots go down deeper. They'll have to look for the water. If you're always just giving it to them, they're going to be the wimpiest things ever. So there's a lot of correlation between childhood and gardening, I think.
And working with Thomas Rayner must have been fantastic.
Oh, and he's just the most delightful human. Just so humble. And what really strikes me about a lot of the professionals I've had the opportunity to work with that I just really, really respect is just how curious they are. And I never, like Fergus, Nigel, Thomas, you just never feel like they know it all. Thomas was asking me questions, and I was just like, little old me, like, what do I know?
Am I right that he comes from Birmingham originally?
It's from Birmingham.
Yeah,
so
I mean, he's practicing in Raleigh, I know now, but I for some reason I thought he was from Birmingham. Yeah,
he's outside DC now, but I think I saw on his Instagram that he was somewhere near Birmingham, and I didn't know him, and I just was like, hi Thomas, I work at the gardens, any chance, like, we'd love to pay for your time to come by. And he just gave so much more than we even asked of him, of his time. And yeah, that's great.
Wonderful. Well, that must have been wonderful for him, but also he had that knowledge, I guess, from his childhood as well, of wild and how plants work in that particular area,
And he grew up in a part of town. I was actually just out there last weekend for a baby shower. It's called Moss Rock. Huge boulder fields, incredibly diverse glades with these little niche species. That there's this one development company in town that their trademark is they buy a lot of land and they come in and they clear cut every last thing off of it, scrape all the topsoil off and sell it. And then they build these cookie cutter houses. And my friend that was in the car with me, I just like went off. I was like, they have no idea, like, especially on it. And she just was like, okay, you're gonna need a pipe down. I was about to walk into a baby shower. And I was like, it just like hurts my heart to watch. But there are so many people that do value,
Yeah.
that what we've been given. And so,
Yeah.
but
But
that is a little bit of a little bit of an uphill battle
but
sometimes.
lovely that you are already in a year, in a year post the gardens, that you are already getting clients that are wanting to do something a little bit different and changing. And the
Oh,
wonderful
and they're
thing-
so patient too, because a lot of times they'll be like, how does this work? And I'll be like, okay,
Mm.
here's what I'm thinking. And I'm like, I don't know everything, but here's, and they'll be patient with me and stay with me as we kind of figure it out together.
Yeah. And the wonderful thing about American gardens is that you don't have the hedges and the boundaries that we do. So people can see what's going on, front gardens, it's open. And so people get to see what the neighbors are doing, which is
I
great.
hadn't thought about that. Yes.
They do get to see more than in England, where everything's a little bit, covered in and behind closed doors. So
And the
yeah.
key for using herbaceous plants and even native plants is orderly frames, is giving that intentioned edge, whether it's like a low stone wall or a mown edge or something, because a lot of people, because people can see, you don't want to be the neighbor that everyone's talking about, like their grass is really long. What are they doing? So you want to show intention. That's been one of the keys that I have found. Because people are not trained to love just like the huge drift of a monoculture of a shrub with the mulch, and it's all pretty, and you have your little pop-up irrigation heads. So it makes them a little nervous when you're mixing things in together.
Yeah. No, I thought that was wonderful. There's no chat. There's nobody asking any questions. So if anybody has a burning question, now is your moment. But I think what's been lovely, because I know a lot about your journey, but to see it all to see it all laid out and how one thing's feeding into another. And so your early sketches from college are so lovely, and that the way you're working with pencil before going into CAD, I think that's so important, all of that. Because there's nothing that replaces that sort of instinctive drawing, that you produce when you're using a pencil and paper.
And what's really amazing is when I do these presentations, I'm looking back at earlier things that I've done. A lot of times I look back and I think the places where I didn't know as much and I'm working from like an instinctive kind of gut response to something is sometimes my best work when I look back.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's actually something I forget to do, is to look back at what you've done before. And also when you're at college, you are much more liberated, I think, because it's all about experimentation, and you don't have to worry about a client and what they're going to think. So looking back at those early sketches and the way you're working, it is important, isn't it, to keep checking back at what you
There's such freedom in school too, because you don't have a contractor who's having to actually like install, you can just dream and push an idea, and you're not worried about all the practicalities of like, should that be 3-inch caliper tree, or does it need to be 15-gallon, or what kind of forklift will they have to get that off the truck? You're just free to design. And so I try and kind of rechannel that sometimes.
And what was lovely was to see that delivery of plants from North Creek. That was really nice.
Yes, a lot came from North Creek. I actually used a place called Izel Plants, and they have on their website live all the availability of so many different native plant nurseries. And then you choose a week you want it delivered, and they mail it all to you in boxes at one time, instead of me having to schedule deliveries from 4 different nurseries.
Yeah, great.
It all comes through them, and it was, I can't sing their praises enough. It was
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Well, we could talk all night, but you've got 4th of July to celebrate.
I do have a barbecue to get to.
You have a barbecue to get to, and I know that you're packing to go away for a long weekend, so have a lovely time.
Thank you.
We've got Margot Martin saying, Molly, that was delightful. As a gardener myself, I appreciate hearing about your journey. I mean, absolutely, it's lovely to hear about other people's journeys. So have a wonderful 4th of July, have a lovely long weekend, and I know I'm going to see you in September, so I'm really excited.
Yes, I can't wait.
Thank you for doing this on a holiday at home. So we really appreciate that. Okay.
No problem.
Lots of love, Molly, and thanks again. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.